let's get started. Of course, I am missing out on my walking up to a big stage in the Star Wars Imperial March music Matt likes to put for me, but well, we do with what we've got. So welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. I have seen on Percona Slack there have been so many people saying hi to each other from so many different countries all around the world, which is pretty cool. Well, I will talk to you about the state of open source databases today, and I decided to take a little bit different path today and look at the history of open source software, which I think the open source databases are really impacted and influenced a lot by. So if you think about the early days of computing, think about like really early days, 2050s or something, then you would have software and hardware were bundled together. And even though we did not have a term open source at those days, the software source was actually open. And one of the big reasons for that was their copyrights of a software was not a thing because the software was not really a thing before that. And we know always the laws tend to move slower and only kind of catch up with technological development. So in the early days, we would have software code, which is the source code was shipped with early software, and early adopters, a lot of them were different universities and so on, would modify the code to fix the bugs and add functionality we need. Well, kind of like advanced open source users do those days. And the changes were openly shared with the academic principles. Now, if you look to late 60s and the early 70s, software was becoming a thing, right? And the computing was growing to be significant industry. The IBM was controlling the vast majority of what was the mainframe market at that time. And in US, there was a lawsuit, antitrust lawsuit against the IBM. So they partly because of that split unbundled software from hardware. Also, Congress acts and makes software copyrightable items, which really creates this multi-billion-dollar separate software industry, right, which is distinct from a hardware industry. And software becomes the major class of intellectual property. And from really those 70s, we see vast majority of software is really being proprietary. Now, when you go to the 80s and 90s, I would call that an era of romantic open source software, right? Because a lot of software at that time was started by hobbyists and really was created to scratch their own itch, right? Or as Linus Torvalds would write in his book, why he created Linux, just for fun, not to become a billionaire, as the later open source creators would pursue, right? And you see on this picture Richard Stallman, which is kind of wearing Percona logo as his hat. I mean, I'm not quite sure why he's doing that, but I thought that's fun picture anyway. When it comes to 2000s, 2000s was really the dramatic decade for open source software. I think especially because the dot-com crash in early 2000s, a lot of companies needed ways to build their solutions very efficiently and Linux, Apache, MySQL, a lot of other open source really allow them to do just that, right? And if you look at the companies born in 2020s, a lot of large internet companies, Facebooks, Twitters, Yahoo's, right? A lot of them would build all the massive infrastructure based on the open source and its core, right? Because of that, open source was also noticed by the dominant companies at the time, like Microsoft, with Steve Ballmer famously referencing to Linux as a cancer at that time. That is also the decade where we would see some significant business outcomes for open source software. Before 2000s, we only had the Red Hat, which went IPO in the late 1990s. In 2000, though, we also have a MySQL who was sold for $4 billion to Sun. And I know now many open source companies have valuations in billions of dollars, but at that time, that was really a big deal. What is also happening in 2000s for open source software is many businesses started to recognize the value of open source software. And we can see increasing amount of companies, large enterprises, starting to adopt the open source first mentality. And that can be seen across large enterprises, and especially, I think, by a lot of governments, because that can help them to also avoid reliance on the companies from other countries, right, which can be potentially challenges. If you look at their businesses, though, a lot of values of the open source software is connected to one thing. It lowers lower cost, short term and long term, right? And you should understand that from a business standpoint, that is the main conversation that you would want to have, because businesses may be talking about how they are all here for world peace, eternal love, having trees grown greener, but in reality, for majority of companies, especially public ones, that is the cost, and something which helps them to succeed in the market is driving their decision. Open source offers direct lower cost in many cases. It also is preferred by developers in many cases, and that's over years becomes easier to find developers which are proficient in open source technologies compared to some exotic proprietary software, which also gets to offer companies better productivity and faster innovation on the given host. And what is also very important is avoiding software vendor lock-in. I think a lot of businesses, they found what they can achieve the most efficiency when they're not locked into just one solution. In hardware, that was achieved relatively easy, right? Like you can get, let's say, server from HP, IBM, Dell, right? They're all speaking 2000, and they're all pretty much the same, right? But that's not, didn't apply to the software, right? If you are using Microsoft SQL Server, you can't move to Oracle easily, and vice versa, right? While with open source software, you can finally break or at least reduce that software vendor lock-in. Now, what also happened in 2000s is what we see open source understood as a great way to start a business and make money. A new generation of open source companies is started with a business idea first. The founders would be actually starting those new companies to make money, not just for fun or to scratch their own itch. A lot of those companies would be venture funded as a result, and because of that, we also need to provide high returns and fast. Because if somebody, venture companies, gives you money, they are not looking for you to grow 5% over the next 50 years, right? That's not how a game is played. Now, that means also for those businesses, the classical business schools approach of growing a business would be applied, right? One is you want to make sure that your marketing is focused on the message which is appeal to the time. And we know open source is a fantastic message with a lot of enterprises pursuing that open source first mentality, right? But then at the same time, you would be thinking how you can build monopoly and avoid commoditization, increases stickiness. So once people start using your software, and what is more important, your the business proposition, they can't leave, and also somehow build anti-competitive modes. So nobody can really really compete with you. Now, what I think is interesting in this case, if you really look at those approaches to business values, many of them kind of go in a conflict with the early stage of romantic open source, right? And open source software values and ideas about, you know, sharing and let other people to innovate on your software, because, hey, that actually can create a competition for you. With that, we can see a lot of business models were evolving from open source to what I would call not quite open source, right? Something which is often marketed as an open source, but not really so. And those models would be open core, open source eventually, such as BSL license, shared source licenses, right, like SSPL, and also open source compatible software, which is especially used by a lot of cloud vendors when you can say, hey, look at that, we have this software which is, of course, proprietary, but actually it is compatible with open source software. You can move from open source software to our solution. Well, you probably would have a very hard time to moving back, but we don't talk about that. Now, with that not quite open source, I think for open source community and the market, that's brought both positives and negatives. On the good side, there is a lot more investments and high pace of innovation in the software around open source community. On the negative side, though, is this software doesn't provide you all the value of a truly open source software, and really market became quite much more complicated, right? I mean, it really becomes very complicated to understand which software gives you all the values you'd expect from open source software and which doesn't. Now, when we move to 2010s, we see the rise of a cloud. And indeed, their cloud like AWS was started in a previous decade, but I think it's 2010s when the cloud was impacting, especially open source databases specifically. The cloud and open source, I think that really brings a lot of challenges and opportunities for open source software, and especially for companies which are looking to build business around the open source. One thing I think what cloud did is what it really hijacked the GPL license. If you look before the cloud, before software as a service, the deployment model, the software vendors who did not want others to build or commercial software on their solutions, right? They can just use GPL. For example, MySQL did that, and they, in the early days, had a very successful dual license business model where companies who would want to build commercial solutions could do that. The cloud changed that. Now, AWS probably makes more money on MySQL than Oracle does, right? And they can just use the GPL software and don't have to pay Oracle anything. I don't know about the details of their commercial relationship, but there is no requirement to do that. Another interesting thing which happened with cloud services is the opposite of what happened in the early 70s, and we have software and the hardware cost are being bundled together, right? So what that means now, if you are looking to spin up let's say your computer instance in the cloud, you will get a per hour fee. If you are spinning up your database instance, like Amazon Aurora or Google Cloud SQL, you also get a fee, which will not bundle software, which will bundle the cost of usage of the hardware and the software together. And that means for the open source can no more benefit of a zero price effect, right? And this is a very important psychological thing which was driving adoption of open source, I think, right? Because in the past, I would have to buy the server separately, right? And then I have a choice. Either I go and pay hundreds of thousands of dollars, right, or tens of thousands of dollars to license Oracle to run on that server, or I go ahead and download Postgres and use it for free, right? That is a very, very powerful. That is not the case anymore, right? It just becomes a case of a difference in the price, which is may not be very well seasoned, understood by people. Also, cloud databases, of course, make it much easier to use than do-it-yourself database solution. Now, another thing which I think has been happening in the market is what this not fully open source software models, they are actually quite accepted on the marketplace, right? More than I would be expecting. And I think that is a very important for us as an open source database community to really educate folks in the market about the difference of the open source and a software which is marketed using the open source term, but not being open source, not providing the true values of open source software. Okay, now let's move to 2020s. And as 2020s just started, I don't have a history, right? And frankly, none of us really knows what is going to happen in this decade completely, but we can see how it is starting. One is we can see what, especially for commercial open source software, the companies who really is focused on monetizing open source, that has been fantastic year, right? I mean, I just looked up a couple of days ago the current valuations for many companies, and you can see there are quite a few companies which have $1 billion plus valuation on the market, right? Or in private, right? So, and these are not even all $1 billion plus companies. What we can see is also, I think, because of success of MongoDB, Elastic, and some other open source companies, we see a lot of investment and a lot of innovation in open source database space. This is just selection of a few database technologies which have started over the last few years, right? And we can see a lot of interesting innovation going on out there, both in terms of design, like distributed databases, as well as in terms of a different database schemas, right? It's not only relational databases. We have a multimodal cloud graph databases, time series focused, and so on and so forth. Now, we also, as we all know, we have a pandemic upon us, right? And while it is of course, incredibly tragic, I think that can have a positive effect to the adoption of open source software, right? Because of a couple of things, a lot of people are pushed to the accelerated to a different digital transformation, be in education or being have to deliver more services online than before, and also needs to either do that at a lower cost or really to need to cut cost in the company, right, due to the economy slowdown. Now, another thing which goes about the database specifically is we have moved to a database as a service as a preferred way to consume open source database software and non-open source as well. And that is very interesting because that really allows the development team to use multiple database technologies, much better matching them to application needs, because we don't really need to install and maintain them, which is hard. On the other side, database as a server, I think, is very commonly marketed by cloud vendors as a fully managed, and they tend to be over-marketed. We hear again and again saying, hey, you know what, we thought it's fully managed database. Because of that, we don't get any DBAs or other database experts on the team. But you know what? This fully managed still needs to be configured for security. Somebody still needs to advise us on a schema, help us to design the queries, and so on and so forth, right? And I think what that is, it comes to this very interesting case where developers choose and use those databases, service databases, without supervision of folks who really understand the databases. And that can cause to a variety of bad outcomes, ranging from security leaks to very inefficient delivery of the database services. Now, if you look at the cloud user in generally, and then look at that again from an open source prism, you can think about the cloud in two ways: either as a commodity, similar to the electricity, right, where you can really swap for one cloud for another very easily, or think about highly differentiated clouds, where you have a proprietary solutions, right, maybe better performance or better usability, right, but they can with a huge vendor lock-in. In my experience, what enterprises do not really want to be hostage. Not again. Many of them, especially in the database space, played this game with Oracle, and they didn't like it. Many of them still do not like it, right, because they are trying to figure out how they can now get rid of those relationship, right, and move to something more sustainable, but that is quite hard. I think where we are moving through is what we can call a multiverse. And Matt Yankovic, who speaks after me, will talk more about that. But this is basically, we are increasingly seeing multiple database technologies are run in multiple environments: hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, and so on and so forth. Now, what is interesting is what that is recognized by many cloud vendors as well, right? We are seeing many proprietary solutions available, such as Google Anthos, VMware, ABS Outposts, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we are seeing the open source is stepping up, and the Kubernetes is also emerged as a leading open source API for those hybrid and public cloud. Now, what is interesting is you do not really get to choose Kubernetes, right, or those proprietary solutions. In many cases, you mix and match those. Like, for example, you would see a proprietary solution to used to simplify the Kubernetes management, right, such as OpenShift by Red Hat and many others. And also, because of Kubernetes is so ubiquitous, majority of those multi-cloud, hybrid cloud platforms, they also support that Kubernetes as an API. How does that apply to the open source databases, right? And what I think we should be focusing on with those developments. One is adapt for cloud native deployment and multi-cloud and hybrid cloud deployments. Many are doing that. A lot of the new generation databases are even built initially to support Kubernetes or adding up, right? So that's already done. And a third item, I think, is what we really need to be thinking about: how to provide simplicity compatible to the integrated database as a service solutions. Because while Kubernetes is wonderful, changing 50 YAML files to deploy your resource on Kubernetes is not the same of a couple of clicks how it takes you to get their Amazon Aurora, let's say deployed on Amazon, which will back itself up, provide you some level of availability, and so on and so forth. Now, as we are looking at database as a service, I think what the database as a service, as a way to consume the database software, is really a winning model for vast majority of their use cases, because that is just so much better, so much easier for developers. And what you want to think in this case is, okay, if that is your choice, if that is what your developers are going to prefer, how do you do that while still keep of most of the value what open source software provide, most of its freedom? And that is a complicated question, and I do not think there is a solution right now on the market which can really came to provide that. Now let me finish up by saying what Percona is doing in this way. We are really embracing the cloud native and multi-cloud approach through Kubernetes. We have released operators for X-Ray cluster for MySQL and also for Percona server for MongoDB, right? And we are also working through usability work with our Percona monitoring and management, right, to really help you to reduce the friction and run the open source databases successfully in those cloud environments and on-prem. With that, that is the end of the informational part of my keynote, but I want to finish up with two announcements. One is we have kicked off an open source data management survey. Please take a time, maybe while you're listening to one of the keynotes on the talks, and fill out this survey. We are sharing all results of this survey publicly under Creative Commons license. And that will really help us to help you, because we can really understand where we should focus our limited resources developing open source software. And finally, I want to say a happy birthday, happy quarantine birthday to the MySQL, which is turning 25 years old this year. I remember when MySQL was turning 20 years, we had a cake to cut at one of Percona Live events. Unfortunately, it is not happening this year because of the quarantine and we're all online, but still I'm wishing a very happy birthday to MySQL. You know, great job, MySQL team. Thank you.